No spoilies. No spoilies.
That's not how you spell it. If you've been skulking around my little backwater channel for long enough, you'll know I have a special place in my heart for the horror game subgenre of small child lost in big scary world, or Sklibsqua. That's never gonna stick. And with the Little Nightmares games being my personal go-to for the best example of this thing. As much as I do enjoy them, I can also see how they're sort of an easy go-to for horror games, since most non-shit people will have their anxieties about a character's well-being amplified if that character is afflicted with the status effect of child. Often these games will forgo a more direct storytelling approach in favour of using the environment to do the work. Bonus points of course if the enemies you face are symbolic of something. When I first heard of today's entry into the subgenre, Gylt, I was interested, but it was originally a Stadia exclusive and I might be a moron of the highest calibers, but I wasn't stupid enough to buy into Google's shitty games console. Not that I'm against the idea of a streaming service for video games, it's actually a decent idea which grants access to thousands of titles without needing to locate and buy them all yourself. However, Google didn't know what the fuck they were doing with it. Even Sony's take on it is better with PlayStation Now, and god it's a sad day when I defend anything that company does. The Stadia crashed and burned, as we all know it was going to, and I fully expected Gylt to go down with the ship because, again, it was an exclusive title and I have a rule about not buying a new console just for the sake of a single game. That rule being, don't do it, you fucking wanker. Words to live by, really. Exclusives still puzzle me, if I'm honest. Hey, we made a game at great expense to ourselves, but you can't have it unless you buy our overpriced console first. Still, I was pleasantly surprised to see Gylt emerge on that hive of scum and villainy that is the modern PlayStation Store, so I scooped it up to have a go. As we're in Spooky Month, let us dive into the world of Gylt and discuss whether or not the game was a hidden gem in a dark dungeon, or if it was actually just a fossilised dog turd that was best left to rot away quietly. Gylt is a third-person horror game that sees the player control a small asthmatic child as she explores a spooky world full of monsters, and my immediate thought was, oh for fuck's sake, writers. Since asthma is one of those easy go-tos for making a child seem more vulnerable without needing to actually expend any effort or creativity, though I will give the developers some credit. One of the first things we learn is that we collect and use inhalers as healing items, which isn't necessarily inaccurate, take it from someone who is themselves asthmatic, so I appreciate that it doesn't get used as a cheap crutch for the story. The game itself doesn't actually have that much in common with the usual Sklibwi games. Oh, for goodness sake, that's a stupid thing to call it. It's more of a survival horror, though that isn't a bad thing. I like a good survival horror, so how does it work? Well, one of the other immediately noteworthy things about Gylt is the presence of combat, as our character Sally can fight back against the baddies using a flashlight. The light can either deal damage to enemies by shining it at their weak points, or you can sneak up behind the monsters and shove it up their arse to do a takedown. The torch utilises batteries as ammo, and taking down enemies in the first method costs less power than option B that deletes them immediately but consumes a whole battery. The torch otherwise doesn't need the batteries to light the way, so wait, what? Okay, so here's the thing about survival horror, the genre of game which Gylt purports to be a member. Survival is a big part of it. It's a game type that challenges not just by having the player need to choose when to take on or sneak around enemies, but it also does so through inventory management. These games are all about careful preparation, weighing the risks, exploring to find the necessary tools to get by. Inventory and resource management is sort of a big deal, and even something as simple as having a torch that needs batteries to work is a contributing element. You know, when it's done right, not the usual horror game method of making it illuminate fuck all and turning on the torch consumes more power than an NFT transaction. The idea should be that if we want to take these enemies down now, or quickly, then we have to risk not being able to see effectively later, and it's not like we'll ever be caught short since batteries are scattered around all over the place, the same is true of the inhalers and the throwable distraction items. The whole setup feels so toothless, and as a result, I was never tense or on edge after the first few minutes, because by then I already knew that I would never be wanting for the supplies that I needed. You do have a stamina meter which you need to outrun the enemies, but it drops quicker than the life expectancy of a submerged billionaire, which I think might be in relation to our asthmatic protagonist, so rather than being a cheap story crutch, it comes around to being a cheap gameplay crutch. Either that or it's just a shitty stamina meter that suffers from the all too common video game problem of being so restrictive that it doesn't add to the experience, it only detracts from it. But please allow me to completely contradict myself for a moment. It's about the only element of survival horror that I was actually worried about, because seeing a street full of monsters would lead to me realising that I couldn't outrun them all if shit went wrong, so I'd have to take a different approach. So I guess credit there, it's the one element of the game that actually needs to be taken into consideration regularly when contending with groups of enemies. The same cannot be said of, well, everything else. Being able to fight back is a tricky thing for these types of games. Some games know how to pull it off. Usually the idea is to make combat inelegant and dangerous. Oftentimes it's only worth engaging in when all other escape routes are cut off, or when the big baddie you're facing has something that you desperately need. Even then though, combat doesn't need to be a last resort to make these games scary. Games like Resident Evil 7 or Bloodborne, yes I do personally count that as survival horror, fight me, make combat a rather central focus, which ties back around into the theme of being prepared. If you didn't take the time to scrounge the useful items from the area, then the next monster could be your undoing. Gylt allows the player player to tackle enemies from early on, and given the fact that our weapon has ammo lying around everywhere, it's often not hard to just delete a group of enemies in an area so you can go about your business without needing to slowly creep through the vents. The main reason that I wouldn't bother with combat during a session was never because the enemy actually intimidated me, I mean fucking look at these things, or because I lacked the items, rather I just wanted to challenge myself and not take the easy route. That said, sneaking's not actually that hard either. It's very obvious when an enemy is about to spot you. They have these noticeable detection meters above them, and if you do make a noise without completely alerting them, then they'll move to where you were when you made the noise. It gives you plenty of time to move around them, and all the levels have numerous vending machines that can dispense cans from at no cost, which work as throwable distractions. Gylt is overly generous towards the player, and that's the main problem. The challenges that the game sets up are offset by the sheer density of items the player can locate in any given area. Sure, our actual inventory space is pitiful, but it doesn't matter when there are 9 inhalers in the next room anyway. Nothing the game can throw at you is all that scary. The default monsters move along predictable paths and all have such a limited awareness that I almost feel bad for them. Later on you will encounter enemies that are invisible, which might seem worrying at first, but they're not actually that hard to spot and they don't do much damage to the player if they do manage to get you, and once you reveal them they're easily destroyed by the light and they only appear in one area. Later still you'll come across enemies that are unaffected by the torch, but like 2 seconds later you'll find a fire extinguisher that recharges its ammo over time so long as you ain't firing it, that can freeze enemies for ages, and when they fall there's a good chance they'll forget all about you. That's a relief, I was getting dangerously close to being engaged there. It's not like the actual monster designs are all that creepy, they're mostly just black goo creatures that have the spatial awareness of Helen Keller and it just looks sort of goofy. They look like a DuckTales monster of the week, easily bested by Scrooge McDuck as he learns a lesson about not judging all goo monsters by one or something like that. I sort of like the crow-faced ones, but realistically they're not more challenging. Sure, they will alert nearby enemies to your presence, but that only works if the nearby enemies are close enough to hear them in the first place, and they basically never were. Their big eyes might suggest they have improved vision, but that's not the case either. I'm convinced they're not actually trying to find me. I'm an obvious child in a bright red raincoat, how hard could they possibly be looking? The other kind of monster are the living dolls, but unfortunately they look too stylized to really be creepy. They look like someone's first attempt at a DeviantArt poster, whilst they do try to be unnerving by repeating the lines, which was uncomfortable at first, but after the 25th utterance I just thought, they tried too hard to be off-putting and came right around to just being annoying. These are the ones that can't be killed with the torch, by the way. You need to freeze these ones, but again, they stay frozen for ages, so evading them had all the challenges opening a bag of rice, and they often forgot all about me. There are some bosses. One is an angry violent fire monster who looks kind of neat, but is a video game boss type enemy where you just have to do the same thing 3 times and then win. And he shows up again later with the exact same requirements to beat him, you're just in a slightly different arena. I just walk him into some water and he dies. It ain't hard. There's a boss that kills you if it can look at you for long enough, which you beat by disabling some projectors, and that was more annoying than anything else, and there is one last monster who's a giant that chases you and tries to eat you. It's weird, the camera for this fight is located in the boss's mouth and it's not really a fight, you just sort of gotta run away. Again, it's not hard, it's just kind of annoying. The only reason I died the first time is because I forgot to press the run button. You know, I'm starting to get the impression that I didn't enjoy the game very much on a mechanical level, which you might think, how did you not notice that earlier whilst you were playing the sodding game, but the thing is, playing Gylt was like watching an episode of EastEnders. It was there, it was in the room, and I was technically engaging with it, but when all was said and done and I put the thing down, I almost completely forgot it existed because it was essentially just white noise. Are there no saving graces? Well, some of the puzzles here and there are not that bad, but it's nothing we haven't seen before in other games, and nothing that really calls for a deep dive or analysis. There's some directing laser beam puzzles, there's some turning valve puzzles, and there's some connecting circuit puzzles. Oh, how innovative you are, Gylt. Are there no effective moments at all? Well, there are a couple of instances where we have to hide from the spotlight boss monster before we actually fight it. If it sees you, it will slowly drain your health and slow you down, which was a little distressing at first, but this thing goes away quickly enough. The actual boss fight has a kid screaming for mercy, which was uncomfortable in that good horror way, but it hardly saved the overall experience. So the gameplay is sort of a net negative for the whole experience. I've played worse designed games and worse executed games, but that's the thing, isn't it? Gylt isn't even the worst at what it does, it's just sort of bland. The graphics, yeah, they're alright. I mean, I can clearly see what everything is and where everything is, and that's literally all I care about as far as graphics are concerned. The art style, yeah, it's alright. I mean, I don't hate it, it's rather cute and distinctive, but I don't think that this specific approach is conjunctive to effective survival horror. Sound design and direction, credit where it's due. I do like the ambient sound effects and backing tracks, they're all right. They do their best to build the atmosphere and tension, and I will award them a little pat on the back for their efforts. Overall though, there's not really anything special about Gylt from a gameplay perspective. As dismissive as I sound, it's not a bad video game, it's just completely mid. It's the Aldi's own brand of survival horror that might sort of do it for some people in a pinch. I do know some people in real life who would likely at the very least be a little bit off-put by the game if they played it, but if you're a hardcore survival horror fan, then Gylt is nothing you haven't seen before. It's a fairly inconsequential and somewhat incompetent attempt at survival horror, but it doesn't offend, not really. There's just nothing about it worth remembering, and I have no real praise for it. Let's see if we can turn that around with with the story section. Does the story make up for what the gameplay lacks? After all, gameplay can just be a way of connecting story bit A to story bit B, and if the narrative itself is deep and interesting enough on its own, then it doesn't really matter if the gameplay falls short, because that's not what we're here for. Short answer, no. Long answer, no, of course it fucking doesn't, what a stupid question. The story revolves around a girl named Sally looking for her missing cousin Emily. Whilst hanging up some missing person signs around town, Sally has to outrun some bullies who either seem to genuinely think Sally is responsible for the disappearance or are just being dicks. They're kids, it's kinda hard to tell. She finds her way to a cable car, and after speaking with an old dude who tells her she needs a ticket only to vanish when she goes to get one, she hurriedly gets on the cart and passes into another world. Sorry, was I not supposed to notice that was clearly what happened? It's pretty obvious that's what's going on here if you've ever engaged with any piece of media ever. Maybe it's a good idea to show it now so that I don't have that mild intrigue as to whether or not this is the real world, because that way I might have been somewhat engaged. No, wait, that's a bad thing. Anyway, she emerges from the cart and finds herself in a monster-infested, decrepit version of her hometown and discovers her missing cousin Emily is here, so goes on a mission to bring her home. As we explore, we can find diary pages left by Emily which recounts the bullying she received as she had just moved in with Sally and was having a hard time adjusting to this new town. It's mentioned by Sally that she feels guilt for not being more helpful during this period, and that's the reason the game is called Gylt. I'm not sure why the misspelling though. The main story will see Sally come closer and closer to rescuing Emily, who doesn't seem to want to go with us, and again it hints at a strained relationship between the two, but it never really gets sorted out by the end. Occasionally this mysterious man will show up to guide Sally in the right direction, though who he is left a mystery until the credits, where I saw the name Charon listed for a character, and I have to assume it was him. In case you didn't know, Charon is the ferryman of the dead in Greek mythology, so this place is probably purgatory or something. The main plot isn't overly complex. Sally seeks Emily, keeps saying that she is sorry, and eventually catches up to her, and the two flee from a big hungry monster as they hurry back to the cable car. The old man appears once again to give us the choice. There's only one ticket and the cart won't move with both of us inside, so we have to choose either to escape ourselves or give the ticket to Emily. Both lead to a short cutscene, but neither are all that deep or emotional since the story isn't very well written or presented. It lacks any subtlety. The central theme of guilt is so one note and obvious, and it doesn't really bother to try and build upon it. Guilt is a funny thing, the emotion, not the game. It can drive people to do things and can serve as a motivation, but a character just feeling guilty because they were a bit shitty to someone isn't very compelling. We kinda need a bit more. Sally feels guilty that Emily ran away, sure, but she didn't get on the cable cart to find her. She was escaping some bullies that wanted to hurt her. It was a massive coincidence that it happened to be where she needed to be. Now I know that all stories could essentially be boiled down to character X was in place Y at time Z to make the plot happen, but you know, there's a limit. Maybe if Sally was investigating Emily's disappearance more directly, which naturally led her to the cable car where she started to suspect something, then we'd get a sense that Sally is so driven by her guilt over failing to protect her kid that she is actively willing to endanger herself or try anything, and hell, as a bonus that would even characterise Sally as someone who's not too bad at detecting. Let's not forget that every action a character takes teaches us something about that character, and the gameplay can be a great medium for letting us get to know who a character is by the things that they can do. What do we know about Sally? Well, she can't really run very fast, and she's kind of asthmatic, and she feels guilty. That's it. Instead, what we get is the bullies chase her and she ends up exactly where she needs to be to make the plot happen. What do we learn by the end? Sally might as well just exposit, "I sure am sad that I didn't do much as an older cousin," and basically does a couple of times, which is a reasonable position to take in and of itself, but it's not that deep or interesting. Guilt is a motivation, but it shouldn't serve as a character's entire character. Guilt, like any other emotion on its own, is useless. I was sad that one time I hit one of my friends in the head with a rock, but that sadness on its own wasn't worth shit. The same is true for Sally's feeling of guilt. The most it drove her to do was hang missing persons posters up around the town. It's not like she's here in this monster world because she wants to be or because she intended to be. And letting us choose how the story ends really robs the narrative of any ability to solidify Sally's character. It's just a lazy choose-your-own-adventure style moment crowbarred into a place it had no business being in. The story really doesn't know how to effectively build on its themes beyond just shouting those themes from the rooftops and expecting applause. Sure, that basic, "oh no, maybe let's not leave a kid in a room full of monsters" feeling was there, but that's some entry-level emotional investment. It's about as hard as trying to get us to sympathise with a cute puppy who lost its favourite toy. Only an absolute bellend wouldn't care, and whilst I do hate every human everywhere all the time, I still prefer to see adults caught in bear traps to children who often haven't lived long enough to be genuine cunts yet. Sally isn't a compelling character, nor is Emily, nor is the old man. They're all one-dimensional, a little more than props, and that really doesn't do anything to help the plot of the game. Like with the gameplay, the story is not offensively bad or anything, it just doesn't really inspire me to want to dig deeper or even remember it after I exit the room and go back to playing Mod Nation Racers. Do you like this discoloured Mod Nation Racers footage? It's the best I could record. I think I'm missing a cable or something. So yeah, Gylt story, kind of forgettable and uninspired. Yeah, Gylt isn't very good and it wouldn't have convinced me to buy into the Stadia thing that used to hold it hostage. It's not bad per se, but it's not an inspiring work by any means, and it doesn't really do anything but aim for the easiest targets. Sure, it hits most of those targets, but it's still not all that impressive. Let me make sure I'm being as clear as I can be here. I don't hate Gylt. It was fine. Hell, I could see myself replaying it if I was bored enough one Saturday night, or if I just wanted to get some extra trophies to inflate that score that no one who matters cares about. It's just that compared to other similar games, it doesn't so much fall short as it does barely try. Its ideas have all been done before and better, and its plot is about as deep and complex as a shot glass half full of water. It's underwhelming, really. Now I'm gonna go play something stimulating like Code Vein or something. See you next time.